Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents When Science Meets Power, First Edition, by Geoff Mulgan. Read by Michael Langan. Introduction. The Science-Politics Paradox. Many of the world's most prosperous cities, including London, Hamburg, and Rome, have within them a research centre studying what are called BSL-4 organisms. These are dangerous organisms which pose a high risk of life-threatening disease, aerosol-transmitted lab infections, or related agents with unknown risk of transmission. The labs that study them are also labelled as BSL-4. They are familiar from the evening news as places full of people wearing what look like spacesuits, and they often show up in Hollywood films. It's estimated that there are some 69 of these, either in operation or construction worldwide. Most are located in urban areas. Most of the people living nearby, which probably includes many listeners of this book, are unaware of them. Most might be shocked if they knew what was being done within them, often with only weak oversight and regulation, and would wonder why they are located in highly populated cities, like the one in Wuhan, which some thought might lie behind the COVID-19 outbreak. Much of their work is necessary, but they are making judgments about risk that have huge significance for everyone else. For example, when they experiment with combining viruses or amplifying their harm or transmissibility. Yet there are no global agreements on how they should be run, no official registries of where they are, what they do, or how safe they are. This is one of many examples of a gulf that has grown up between science, which is often necessary and inspiring, but also often opaque and secretive, and public interest or public dialogue, or what some would call common sense. They are examples of the challenge every society has of exercising power over knowledge, and reminders that while science may save us, whether from diseases and natural threats like asteroids, it may also kill us, whether with a nuclear Armageddon, invented pathogens, or wayward intelligence. The ambiguities of science and technology are evident in the impacts of the many technologies that have seen exponential improvements in recent years. The processing power of computers has roughly doubled every 2 years in line with Moore's law. The cost of sequencing the full human genome fell from around $100 million 2 decades ago to $100 today, while the cost of solar-powered electricity fell almost 90% in the 2010s alone. These advances happened alongside stagnant incomes for many in countries such as the US, stagnant well-being, declines in social connectedness and mental health, as well as worsening global ecological indicators and signs of potential systems collapse. Young people reflect these paradoxes. Most are very positive about science and technology, more than their parents' generation, and technology plays a big part in their lives. According to one survey of 20,000 young people across the world, 84% of them say that technical advancements make them hopeful for the future. But this enthusiasm for science combines with pessimism. In 16 out of 20 countries, more young people believed the world was becoming a worse place to live than believed it was becoming better, with many of the reasons cited being indirect effects of science, from workplace automation and climate change to the harmful effects of social media. Science is the most extraordinary collective achievement of the human species, a set of methods, mindsets, theories, and discoveries that have changed every part of our lives. But these paradoxical patterns show that a powerful method for amplifying human intelligence is not always so intelligently directed. So you might expect that the question of how to govern science, how to mobilize its benefits but avoid its risks, not just in biohazard labs but also in everything from artificial intelligence and food systems to space warfare, would be one of the most important questions of our times. But how? Scientists have long argued that they should be given the maximum freedom to explore and discover. While there are good arguments for this, particularly in more fundamental science, it becomes ever less plausible the closer science and technology come to daily life. Although scientists are typically intelligent, thoughtful, and decent people, it's not obvious that they can be trusted to govern science, any more than the military can be put in charge of wars. Science alone can be tunnel-visioned. It needs other perspectives to show how to avoid harm. This is where institutions come in. Our societies are made predictable and manageable through institutions. It's through institutions that a public interest comes to be refracted. Within nations, an array of funders, regulators, agencies, commissions, and parliamentary groups try to steer science and innovation. But there are glaring governance gaps where institutions are needed, whether in relation to AI and cybersecurity or synthetic biology. Moreover, public influence over science has declined in recent years as the proportion of R&D dominated by big firms has grown. Amazon, for example, spent $40 billion on R&D in 2020, more than all but a handful of countries. The UK's public R&D budget that year was around $14 billion. Finland's around $2.3 billion. These gaps are even more evident at a global level where there is little effective governance. We have a World Bank, an International Monetary Fund, and numerous other funds and development agencies, but the world lacks institutions charged with reflecting on science, its aims and its methods, or judging whether the world's research capacity is directed to the right tasks and with the right methods. Scientists have achieved many breakthroughs in global cooperation, often below the radar of formal politics, from the rules of the Internet to the management of Antarctica and nuclear non-proliferation. Yet the best available data show a striking lack of alignment between what the world has decided are its top priorities, summarized in the Sustainable Development Goals, and the priorities of science and technology. Scientists are periodically involved in public calls to guide, constrain, or rein in powerful technologies, particularly artificial intelligence. But, as I show later, these are usually so vague and so devoid of any plan of action or any language for thinking about governance that they have little impact. In the 19th century, as constitutional monarchy became the norm in much of Europe, it was said that monarchs now reigned, but didn't govern. Science is now in an opposite position. It governs but doesn't reign, and is only loosely accountable for the power it exercises. Some of the reasons for this lie in the blind spots and biases of science itself. Scientists say they can't make policy, that they have neither the skills nor the inclination to do so, and they fear being tarnished if they get too close to the grubby, compromised world of actual government. Yet their de facto power makes this position of detachment increasingly implausible. Politics should be the answer, since it is the main way we make collective decisions. But politics looks ill-suited to the task of governing science. The dominant forms of modern politics were shaped in the 19th century. Rule by representatives concentrated in parliaments in capital cities, with periodic elections, manifestos, and programs. There has been relatively little advance since then, despite many experiments on the periphery, from citizen assemblies and deliberations to virtual parliaments. Instead, politics often looks petty, short-term, half-informed, or irrelevant. The ways in which politicians are recruited and promoted don't fit well with the tasks they have to fulfill, and their roles are almost unique in being so unsupported by professional training. Most learn on the job. I've sometimes played a slightly mean trick on senior figures in politics. I asked them if they could give a 5-minute talk on how the Internet works. Almost none can, though they use it for many hours a day. They know next to nothing about how it functions or about the material reality of undersea cables and switches or the organization of addresses and protocols. Essentially, for them, it is magic, which perhaps helps explain why governments and parliaments found it so hard to respond intelligently as the Internet transformed so many areas of life, both for better and for worse. So, for politics to play the roles that only politics can play, we need a radically reformed politics. This is what I call the science-politics paradox. Only politics can govern and guide science in the public interest, but politics has to change to be able to do this, to become more knowledgeable, more systematic in its methods, and some of the time, more scientific, benefiting from what I call the new curriculum for power that encompasses data and systems, complexity and psychology, as well as politicians' more traditional grounding in law and economics. I use Hegel's story of the master and the servant as a way to make sense of this dynamic. Politics, the putative master, has nurtured a servant who now greatly outstrips the master in terms of capability and knowledge. Science has gained a de facto sovereignty of its own that sits along the traditional sovereignty of politics. The servant has, to some extent, become a master. Most of our collective decisions now involve science, from pandemics to climate change, the upbringing of children to clean air. And that collective knowledge now makes a claim that complements the claim of votes or the desires of citizens. But science has little to say on how we make these collective judgments, and little to say about questions of meaning or wisdom. It can tell us what is and what might happen, but it can't tell us what matters, or what we should care about. For that, we need politics, in its broadest sense. The idea that governments can simply follow the science quickly falls apart on inspection. Here, I draw on Aristotle. He distinguished between ethics, which concerns what is a good life for an individual, and politics, which is concerned with the good life for a community. He believed that the health of the polis was essential to the full realization of human potential. He saw political science as a master discipline, the architectonic which sits above the other disciplines, and, he wrote in the Nicomachean Ethics, that since political science uses the rest of the sciences, and since again it legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from, the end of this science must include those of the other sciences, so that its end must be the good for humanity. 2,000 years later, politics can still override all other fields and disciplines through its power to make laws. In doing this, it draws on ethics but goes broader. Indeed, most of the decisions to be made about science and technology go far beyond ethical reasoning. They involve very political judgments about who benefits and loses, and they are highly contextual. The fashion for creating centers around the ethics of science, from biosciences to AI, is an understandable response to the failures of politics and often produces intelligent commentary. But I suspect in the future it will be seen as a category error. Ethics alone cannot tell us how to design a system of welfare, when to fight wars, how to tax or how to police, or how to guide powerful new fields of science. It is a political question, not an ethical one, whether power needs to be mobilized to block, accelerate, or guide science and technology, with the authority to inspect, analyze, and assert rules and laws. It is a political question whether power needs to be mobilized to influence how technology is itself enabling new forms of power, such as monopoly, predation, or abuse. And it is a political question whether power needs to be mobilized to distribute the benefits of new knowledge, such as genetic enhancement. During the course of the book, I dive into the nature of these relationships with power. I describe the complex history of state involvement in science, how states saw science as the means to military prowess or economic prosperity, the rising concern with risk, and the practical problems faced by governments and parliaments grappling with science advice. I described the clashing logics of science, politics, and bureaucracy, and the ways in which these logics have a life of their own. My conclusion is that we need a simultaneous scientization of politics and a politicization of science, reinventing both so as to cultivate sciences that are reflexive and self-aware of their own limits, and politics that are sufficiently well-informed to guide processes that are often opaque, uncertain, and hard to grasp. This is not an argument for scientists becoming partisan. Quite the opposite. The more scientists appear parti pris, using their authority as scientists to endorse views that have nothing to do with science, the less they will be trusted. The more they appear closed and narrow in their thinking, the less reason we will all have to take their conclusions seriously. For me, the politicization of science is more about scientists taking responsibility for the state of their society and being willing to engage in argument and debate about its priorities. It is about acknowledging that many of the most important decisions to be made about science are essentially political. The heart of my case is an argument for metacognition. Metacognition is the crucial skill schools teach children, a skill of thinking about how to think and knowing what the appropriate ways of thinking are for different tasks. In science and technology, there are often very strong systems for cognition, but only weak ones for metacognition, for reflecting in a rounded way on complex choices. This kind of metacognition amplifies the spirit of science, the commitment to exploration and doubt, but it sometimes challenges the practice. It also amplifies the best of democratic politics, a willingness to engage with other people and other views, and challenges its tendency to become narrow. That requires a skill in looped rather than linear thinking, since multidimensional knowledge that encompasses ethics, politics, and much more, ultimately has to take precedence over the less dimensional knowledge of individual scientific disciplines. To handle a complex task like managing a pandemic, averting climate change, banning rogue AIs, or fighting a war requires multiple types of knowledge, of which scientific knowledge is only one, and not always the most important. It's necessary, in other words, to zoom out before zooming back in. The mark of a mature political system, I argue, is that it has many different ways of mobilizing knowledge, suitable for tasks with varying degrees of technical and moral complexity, varying links to the daily life of citizens, and varying degrees of uncertainty, and that it can explain why different ones are used for different purposes. Metacognition underpins synthesis. Science has extraordinarily strong tools for analysis and discovery, but it has surprisingly weak methods for thinking across boundaries or for synthesis. This became very apparent during the pandemic as some scientists became very powerful, but could not articulate how they would weigh up physical health against mental health, the needs of the economy, or education. They could be hugely impressive within their domains, for example, modeling the risks of transmission or accelerating the development of vaccines, but were oddly inarticulate across domains. Yet many of our big challenges, from the complexities of shifting towards a hydrogen-based economy to population mental health, requires exactly this kind of synthetic or holistic thought and action. Science often governs itself. When it doesn't, it is still much more often directed to the interests of states or of corporations than it is to the wider public interest. This is one field that has yet to democratize its governance, to ensure that common knowledge serves common interests. As I show, there is a wide gap between what the public say they want science to focus on and where brain power is actually directed. This may be why, in the UK, for example, a majority say that R&D does not benefit them. To better serve the public, we also need better anticipation. Science produces new knowledge, but also new risks, and so, for any society, and for the world as a whole, the ability to understand, spot, anticipate, and prevent is vitally important. Yet in most fields we have only weak institutions to do this. The IPCC attempts to anticipate trends in climate change, but is interesting in part because it is such an exception, with no equivalents in fields like artificial intelligence. Anticipation in conditions of uncertainty points to actions that need to be different in nature from traditional laws and programs. Precisely because of the uncertainties surrounding science, they have to be revisable decisions. Decisions that include clarity on the triggers or new facts, which would require a change to the decision. Regulation needs to become more anticipatory, able to anticipate technological change and to shift quickly in the light of its actual patterns, whether in relation to drones or quantum computing, genomics or self-driving cars. And rather than one-off inquiries and commissions, we need more permanent, continuous assessment of benefits and risks, what I call science and technology assemblies, which bring together experts, politicians, and the public at every level, from cities to nations to the world, and are supported by well-curated knowledge commons. These need to be both political, in the narrow sense of engaging with interests and values in the present, but also super-political, in the sense of seeking to take account of the interests of future generations. These arguments about the how of government and governance reflect the shifting nature of truth. States rest for their legitimacy on claims about truth, sometimes arbitrary and sometimes accurate. Science, too, aspires to the discovery of truths. Yet we are in a time when truth can seem slippery, when innumerable fakes, false images, videos, and misleading claims proliferate, with deception becoming cheaper and more commonplace, making it harder than ever to know what to believe. In this context, infrastructures of verification become even more important, and professions with a vocation for proof and truth become ever more socially vital. The basic methods of science, which involve skepticism and rigorous method to get closer to truths, matter not just to the work of science itself, but to almost everything else. Indeed, the original motto of the Royal Society, founded in London in the 17th century, nullius in verba, is even more relevant in an age of wars over truth. The motto essentially means, don't take anyone's word. Instead, test, interrogate, probe. This, the wider value of science, makes it even more important that scientists engage. I argue for a relational turn, that science needs to work harder not just at explaining, but also at listening, responding, and opening up to democratic input. It is still common to hear scientists talk as if communication was enough to ensure trust. This is wrong. Scientists will be respected for their expertise, but in the long run, they will only be fully trusted if they are seen to care about the interests of the public. The core insight of politics is that it is only through expression, argument, and competition that we discover and express common interests. The core insight of science is that only through detached observation, experiment, and skepticism that we discover useful truths. And the core insight of bureaucracy is that only through creating institutions, roles, and rules that we make things happen. This book makes the case for fusing these insights into a new generation of institutions to shape science, supported by new logics, that can help whole societies think together about their choices and implications, from data and evidence to imaginative speculation. Their task is to think and act synthetically, connecting the 4 stages that are vital for any governance of science and technology: analysis and observation, assessment and interpretation, action using the full range of possible tools, from laws and regulations to funds, and then adaptation in the light of what happens. In emphasizing action and learning, I take a different view from that of many writers on science, particularly in the field of science and technology studies, some of whom have opted for detachment, observing and analyzing, but steering clear of prescription. I suggest that their stance is a symptom of a more widespread dynophobia, a fear that any engagement with power will be corrupting, fear that mirrors the excessive dynophilia of many politicians and officials, who perhaps love power too much and knowledge too little. Many academics avoid making proposals, designing options, and advocating for them, preferring to stay in the safer place of observation and critique. The result is a deficit of designs that becomes very obvious when, for example, societies need better ways of governing technologies, such as artificial intelligence. At a time when we badly need useful options for the synthesis of science, politics, and ethics, whether in government or business, many of those with the deepest knowledge of the issues are mute. The job of creating and implementing such designs is a truly political task. With any emerging field of science and technology, a society has to decide whether to encourage it or discourage it, to fund or defund it, to establish new rules or institutions to guide it, or to opt for benign neglect. These decisions are partly fractal, made not just in laws but also in the conscience of individual scientists, the management of firms or foundations, shaped by media and movements. But many of the most important decisions, at some point, return to politics. Part 1. How Science Meets Power. 1. Uneasy interdependence. Science is all around us, and, if we look into the future, its significance is only set to grow. Science shapes our health and fuels new technologies increasingly integrated into our bodies, our homes, and our cities. It illuminates the cosmic context of our lives and reveals the minutest details of life. It is a source of wonder, inspiration, and awe. Now, unlike our predecessors, we often can't help but see things through a scientific lens. A patch of parched grass may be seen as the result of climate change. Unruly children may be interpreted through the lens of the science of parenting. A fast food shop may be looked at through what we know of nutrition or obesity. In all these ways, scientific reasoning connects to, and sometimes displaces, other lenses. Land seen primarily through the lens of belonging. Food through the lens of pleasure and gratification. Children through the lens of belief or the sanctity of the family. But to the extent that science has grown, so too has it become more dangerous. Some still hold to a view of science as cool, calm, and ordered, with the quiet hum of laboratories and people in white coats bringing sanity and rationality, where once there was chaos, capriciousness, and violence. However, this picture is not accurate. New knowledge is unsettling and destabilizing. It answers some questions but generates new ones. Ever more of the risks we face are the results, either direct or indirect, of scientific progress, from the development of a carbon-based industrial civilization to nuclear and biological weapons, rampant artificial intelligence, to genetically modified organisms. New knowledge destroys old jobs as well as old sources of authority. It reveals new areas of ignorance and creates new anxieties and justified fears. This is the paradox of science, that it is both ever more vital and ever more dangerous. This is obvious when we look at the countless threats that originate in science, from pathogens to pollutants. The Commission for the Human Future, in 2022, for example, highlighted 10 potentially catastrophic threats to human survival, a list similar to many other ones. These are, in no particular order: 1. Decline of natural resources, particularly water. 2. Collapse of ecosystems and loss of biodiversity. 3. Human population growth beyond Earth's carrying capacity. 4. Global warming and human-induced climate change. 5. Chemical pollution of the Earth system, including the atmosphere and oceans. 6. Rising food insecurity and failing nutritional quality. 7. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. 8. Pandemics.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?